Hey art nerds, so we have reached the end of our watercolor pencil review series, but fear not, I have saved the best for last. Today, we're talking about the creme de la creme of Caran D'Ache's lineup, the Museum Aquarelle Watercolor Pencil. Now, Caran D'Ache promises watercolor quality pigments in these watercolor pencils, such high promises, so I've got high expectations and high standards that I'm going to hold these to. In the past, I reviewed the Caran D'Ache Supracolor 2 watercolor pencils. Really liked it. It's a staple of my watercolor pencil collection. So not only am I going to be reviewing the Caran D'Ache Museum Aquarelle watercolor pencils for you guys today, but I'm also going to compare them to the Supracolor 2s to help you guys figure out if these are really worth the $440 price tag that each pencil carries. So these are Caran D'Ache's highest grade of watercolor pencil. They promise extra fine watercolors in the shape of a pencil. They also promise the strength and effects of genuine watercolor. Concentrated pigments ensures complete solubility, superb transparency, and optimal lightfastness. They have a 3.8 millimeter lead on the inside and come in 76 total colors. They're Swiss made and they're available open stock and in sets. And you can get them in sets of 12, 20, 40, 76, and in a wooden collector's box of 80. According to Wet Paint, they also promise 100% water-soluble immediately and totally, an optimal transparency with no veiled effects, a range of 76 brilliant and vibrant colors, exceptional color light fastness applied wet or dry according to the standard blue wool scale, high pigment density, and available in standard and themed assortments like marine, landscape, etc., as well as in separate colors. So here at the top, we have our Supracolor 2, and then below it is our Museum Aquarelle. So Supracolor 2 watercolor pencils are usually around $2 each, whereas the Museum Aquarelle watercolor pencils are $440 open stock, and that seems to be a pretty standard price for open stock Museum Aquarelle. Now, if they really do perform as well as other forms of watercolor, tube or pan, then they're worth the price. However, if they don't perform as well, I am definitely going to have words to say about it. Speaking of words, you guys can find all of the links to my sources down in the description below. So if I cite something, I've linked it, as well as an abbreviated transcript for those of you who prefer to read while you listen or you want to go back and check for some facts. So these pencils feature a matte gray body with a color cap on the end and silver body screening. They and the Supracolor 2 both have a hexagonal body. The Lightfast rating is screened on the side and it's out of 5 stars. Most of the pencils that I've purchased have 5 stars. The lowest has 3. I wasn't searching for light fastness. I was picking for colors that I could do a color wheel with. So it does seem like there's a lot of really light fast colors in the set. Now, it's a little bit difficult to find a swatch chart, but Jackson's has it. I'm going to link it down in the description below. And their swatch chart shows some colors with granulation, which is something I'd really love to see more watercolor pencils be able to offer, but I've yet to really encounter it during most of my field tests. They also promise that these are going to be very light fast and water fast, which are traits that India ink pigments like the Albrecht Dürer and Inktense tend to embody. So I currently own 14 colors, and I've made an attempt to purchase a cool red, a warm red, a cool blue, a warm blue, a decent yellow, some greens, and some skin tones. So let's go ahead and dive into our swatching. I'm using a Copic marker to draw some black lines. This is going to allow us to test for opacity, since Caran D'Ache promises that there's going to be no veiled colors here, which I can only assume they mean muddiness or they mean opacity. I'm going to swatch all 14 colors that I have, and I also have 5, let's not say dupe colors, but similar colors, either they share the same name or they are very, very similar, from the Supercolor 2 line. Now, not all of my museum aquarelles have the color name listed on them, but all of them have the color line, aka Museum Aquarelle. They have the little watercolor brush logo, they have Caran D'Ache, and they have the color number. They also have a barcode and a lightfast rating on the opposite side. They both do and do not share the same color code with the Supercolor 2 line. Scarlet, for example, is 3510-070 for Museum Aquarelle, whereas it's 3888070 for Supercolor 2. So the last 3 digits are going to correspond if you're looking to do color matching between the 2 lines. Now, I don't own all the Supercolor 2s, which I also purchased open stock, nor do I have all the Museum Aquarelle. So I'm going to try to do a comparative review based on what I have. So during this swatch test, I'm testing for opacity, creaminess of application, water solubility, and relifting. With the dry swatching, I'm swatching scarlet, light cadmium red, yellow, grass green, phthalocyanine green, light malachite green, phthalocyanine blue, dark ultramarine, light blue, anthraquinoid pink, sanguine, burnt ochre, light flesh, and apricot. And most of my pencils don't have the color names, so names and pigments were pulled from the Caran D'Ache swatch sheet provided by Jackson's. You guys can check the transcript down in the description below for the pigment information. Cross-referencing this tiny chart online just to get the color names and pigment numbers was kind of a pain. This should have been on the Caran D'Ache site in English. So I hope the names on the barrels are a new pencil thing and not an old pencil thing. Now, these are fairly buttery and they're not dusty. And dry, they're not any more spectacular than any other decent watercolor pencil, and they're not as buttery as many oil-based color pencils. I've seen some reviews online comparing these to as high quality as the highest quality color pencils. I would say they're a little bit drier and more dusty, not as buttery as, say, Faber-Castell's Polychromos. So I'm also doing some large swatch blocks here. I'm going to wet one half and leave the other half dry so that you guys can more easily see how the colors compare wet versus dry. And I wasn't able to find pigment information for Supercolor 2, so I can't necessarily compare the pigments between the 2 lines. This has been a pretty common occurrence with my watercolor pencil reviews, even to the point where I'll write into companies and request the pigment information, and they'll give me a shady answer like, oh, we use student grade watercolor pigments, but not give any specifics. Now, as an artist, I like to know the materials I'm working with. This is important to me. I might have toxicity issues or allergy issues, or I might have a small child. So I think companies should be required to list their pigment information in addition to what binders they're using, rather than just saying, oh, it's non-toxic. I want to know that for myself. Now, if you guys feel the same way, let's make this a more common demand, a more common request in the US, that pigment information is made accessible and available. So next up are the Supercolor 2, the small handful of Supercolor 2s. And the Museum Aquarelle is maybe a little more buttery than the Supercolor 2. The colors I swatched for Supercolor 2 are light blue, blue, ultramarine, lemon yellow, and scarlet. And I think there's only 3 exact color name matches between the 2. I also noticed, as is common between, student grade and professional grade, that sometimes colors that share the same name between the two lines are different colors. So scarlet and light blue are actually kind of different colors here. And I'm going to demonstrate this with a head-to-head comparison, where at the top is the Museum Aquarelle, at the bottom is the Supercolor 2 swatch. So all of our swatches have been filled in. Now it's time to grab a cup of clean water and do some wet swatching. So again, I'm looking for opacity, creaminess of application, water solubility, and these promise no relifting, so we shouldn't see any of that. So for the Museum Aquarelle, colors seem to activate fully, which is nice. There's so many watercolor pencils where they don't really reactivate, or they are kind of scratchy or very pale. So it's nice that I'm getting full color reactivation. That's something you definitely want to see with watercolor pencils. And when they're wet, you really do get some vibrant color with these. There's some sedimentation with some colors, which is nice to see, as you don't get the flat color that you would get from the Albrecht Dürer or Inktense watercolor pencils. The opaque colors are interesting. They're almost like Gensai colors. These activate a lot of color. A little can go a long way, and it could be used for coverage. Some watercolor pencils are fairly anemic in terms of color released. Now, the water in the cup gets muddy fast, but I also introduced a lot of very opaque colors to the test. Now, usually I would use how quickly the water muddies in the cup as, a chance to judge how many optical brighteners might be used in these. So for the Supercolor 2 wet swatches, these don't activate nearly as much as the Museum Aquarelle. You can still see pencil marks. The color isn't nearly as strong either. There's some granulation with some colors, particularly blue and aquamarine. Per swatch, the Museum Aquarelle seems to contain a lot more paint than the Supercolor 2. So now I'm swatching the larger fields of color, and like I said, these have a lot of color, a lot of pigment. So I think you could even do like a paper palette where you create swatches like this, and then like when we were kids, color by number, you can pick up some of the color and apply it. So this could be a way to kind of prepare easy, low mess, low cleanup watercolor palettes. If you were doing travel watercolor and maybe you had really limited space, you could fit this and your paper in a single folder and be ready to go. So this could be a way to do travel watercolor quite easily. Now, these pencils were purchased out of pocket from my own funds and funds raised from my Patreon. We don't see any sort of outside sponsorship, and these pencils were not sent to me to review. I create watercolor comics. You can check out 7-Inch Cara, my watercolor comic, for free at 7inchcara.com. And it's really important to me to find economical but the best performing art supplies. So I really want to get the best bang for my buck. And that led me into reviewing art supplies and sharing my findings with other artists in hopes that it could be helpful. So if you guys enjoyed this video, do me a favor and share it on your favorite social media site or a watercolor review site that you enjoy and you use, and let me know in the comments that you actually enjoy this. Also, I want to hear, are there any watercolor pencils that I haven't reviewed that you'd like to see me review? Check out the watercolor pencils playlist and see if I've missed anything, and then let me know down in the comments below. So here are the swatches after they've had a chance to dry. They're still pretty vibrant. They're still pretty brilliant. Sometimes with watercolor, they'll dry a lot duller than they are when they're wet. Like this is particularly true of some of the Artist Loft watercolors. So it's nice to see that they retain their vibrancy. So I've included the Caran D'Ache Museum Aquarelle swatches from Jackson's. Again, link down in the description below. They tend to have really fair prices on watercolor supplies. I know it's hard to see here, but like I said, there'll be a link in the description. This is where I was able to get most of my pencils' names as well as all of the pigment information, which I think is pretty important, and I wanted to share it with you guys. If you, like me, feel pigment information should be accessible and easily available, let Caran D'Ache know. They are going to do what their customers demand. So next, we're going to do a color wheel swatch. And this means we use a warm red, a cool red, a warm blue, a cool blue, a warm yellow, a cool yellow. Oh wait, we've only got one yellow for today. So we're using everything except for one yellow that's going to have to serve shift as both a warm yellow and a cool yellow. And we're creating a color wheel, and this is going to help us gauge how well these colors actually mix, how well they layer, whether they mix well with actual mixing, like physical mixing, whether they mix well with optical mixing. And this is going to give us a good idea of just how much these actually handle like real water, I say real, like tube or half pan watercolor paints. It's unfair for me to say real watercolor, like watercolor pencils aren't real watercolor. Although there's been so many watercolor pencils that I've reviewed that didn't handle like watercolor in any way, shape, or form. It's nice to see though that the Museum Aquarelle, especially at $4.40 USD, each open stock, do indeed handle more like traditional watercolors in terms of reactivation and color saturation. So visual color mixing is pretty unimpressive with these, and this is when they're dry. Maybe it's the colors I've selected. The yellow is warmer than I kind of expected. So what I'm doing down at the bottom is we're going to do a little physical color mixing in addition to the color wheel, where we're going to try to mix up some secondary colors using our primary colors. And this is a good test to see if you can kind of get away with a smaller watercolor collection. So with traditional watercolors, whether they're tubes or pans, theoretically you can mix almost any color you need from just 6 colors. The one shown here with the addition of a cool yellow. With watercolor pencils though, this is often not the case, and you may need to buy secondary and tertiary colors to get the range you want. Now me, I would have all of the art supplies, but I do like to see that watercolors and watercolor pencils are able to kind of extend beyond just the colors you purchased. This allows people who are on a budget to be able to make the same kind of art that somebody who has access to more art supplies would be able to make. So I do think it is important, particularly with more pricey watercolor supplies like these. So our color wheel when wet. When wet, the colors mix pretty cleanly and are fairly vibrant, especially like with this purple here, we get a pretty nice mixed purple. A decent amount of granulation also adds some visual interest. Now, if you don't like the granulation, I would recommend you go with an India ink based watercolor pencil like the Derwent Inktense or the Faber-Castell Albrecht Dürer watercolor pencils. I find that that kind of dulls the illustration though. I like the granulation. So I've noticed with these little swatches here that the yellow has a tendency to be overpowered by the other colors in the mix, particularly the reds. So our oranges are not as orangey, they're really more scarlet or red orange than like a lighter orange. Now you could get away with just adding a lighter mix of red, a lighter application of red on top of your yellow. We are able to mix some really nice, vibrant greens, particularly the phthalocyanine blue with our yellow makes a really nice sort of spring green, or kind of a true green, a green most people would think of as green. Now for purples, you're never going to really be able to mix like a true rich blue-ish royal purple. That's a dioxazine purple and you're probably going to have to buy that. But we are able to get a pretty decent red violet and kind of a maroon red as well. So short of doing a full-on field test with these, and I'm not that kind of a watercolor pencil person, I like using them usually as an accent, although these are good enough that I might want to do a field test with them. The verdict on these pencils is these are really good, but at $4.40 a pop, they're pretty pricey compared to other watercolor pencils. They're like double the cost of most other watercolor pencils. So the pros are there is so much pigment in these and very little dust. I can actually identify the pigments used. These are common watercolor pigments. That's a good thing. They're using the same kind of pigments that popular brands would use. There's some granulation that adds visual interest, and they're very light fast, and it's a compact format since they're in a pencil form. The cons, that price. They're not as buttery as oil-based color pencils, so they're not going to work quite as well doing double shift as just regular dry color pencils. Not all pencils have the color name on the barrel. That's a big ding for me. I don't want to have to remember codes. It would even be better if you just listed the pigment information. It would mean about as much as the code. And you have to dig for the pigment information. It's not easily available on the Caran D'Ache site. That's a big ding. I went to like 5 different sites, from Blick to Jerry's to Caran D'Ache to Jackson's finally had the pigment info. All of them should have had the pigment info. For how I use watercolor pencils, mainly as an accent rather than for the whole piece, these pencils are a little bit pricey for me. However, if you love watercolor pencils and you use them for a large portion of your art, these are probably well worth the price. So I hope you guys found this review helpful, useful, and informative. It's the last watercolor pencil review in my series for the time being. Let me know down in the comments below if I've missed any pencils that are great and deserve recognition. I've even reviewed some really budget pencils like the Prismacolor watercolor pencils and even Crayola. So if you want to see how those compare to professional watercolor pencils, check out those videos. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want to help me make more like it, you can join me on Patreon, and I hope to see you guys again soon. Bye, guys!